Libertarian Party of Minnesota. This evening, we are talking with Kevin Bradley, who is a former hospice chaplain. I want to make sure I got that all right. And he is a member of the LPMN, has been active in the party for a long time. And I got introduced to him several months ago and immediately started to listen to some of his ideas and his positions on death with dignity. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. Can be kind of a, depending on which circle you're in, controversial topic, but I wanted to listen to what he had to say and especially get his perspective on that with his background and as a libertarian himself. So, Kevin, how's it going?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So explain to us a little bit about just the basis of what death with dignity is.
Okay, well, it's most often associated with what they call medical aid in dying, which is when a person has the legal right to have a prescription medication that will help end their life. And it's most often, some people may know about it because of Oregon was the first state that made it legal. So that's what usually people are talking about when they talk about death with dignity is medical aid in dying. It's also called the right to die movement. In fact, the longer known term is right to die, but it kind of became known as death with dignity because the Oregon law was called the Death with Dignity Act. So that kind of shifted things around as far as the public perception.
So how often, as a former hospice chaplain, how often did you have to interact with people that were, taking this kind of an approach with their own impending deaths?
Well, none of my patients were allowed to do that because the hospice organizations in general are very much opposed to this.
Okay.
But I will tell you that I had several patients who would very privately ask me if there's something I could do to hurry along their dying process. And I never knew whether they just thought because I was a chaplain, I have some connection, I could pray or something, or if they really thought I could give them some medication. I never really pursued that. But on several occasions, something I learned as both a hospice chaplain and then as a hospital chaplain, and I did that first, is patients will tell chaplains things they won't tell anybody else.
Right.
And so these patients, like I said, several of them asked me if there's something I could do to hurry along the process. And one of the things that kept coming up in conversations was that they felt that they were just, they had no dignity, no purpose in life, and they were just done. They were just ready to go.
What kinds of, sicknesses, diseases, injuries, that kind of stuff were they going through where that, so my husband's mom died of lung cancer in 2017 and was on hospice. It had metastasized. There was nothing, So I remember, sitting with her through those long days of, her just sleeping. But what were the kinds of things that, diseases, sicknesses that they were going through that were, kind of prolonging the agony? I mean, obviously, death is part of life, and that is going to be the end result.
Sure. Well, cancer, of course, is probably one of the main ones nowadays. It used to be that people would die more often of, heart attacks, usually a little bit earlier. But now people are more dying of heart disease. They're longer lasting. And so there's more of suffering involved because it's not quick. One of the things about medical aid in dying laws is that they're very restrictive, and they really have to be in order to get the laws passed because there's understandably a lot of concern about it. So in order to get it legalized or passed, the Oregon people agreed to very, very strict restrictions. And one of them, the main one, is that a patient must be diagnosed with a terminal illness, and terminal is defined as being within 6 months of a natural death anyway. So for that reason, the people who are supporters of medical aid in dying can honestly say it's not suicide because these people are not choosing to die. That decision has been made for them. The disease is killing them. They just want to
Right.
have some control over the end of their life. And especially some people are about pain, but pain is actually not usually the main thing. It's just a loss of autonomy and personhood.
Okay. So we're going to have another co-host on here pop up. And hi, Joey. How's it going? We were having technical issues earlier, so I asked Joey to come on because sometimes having two of us and, we can
Sure.
ask questions back and forth.
Yeah.
So we are talking with Kevin about death with dignity. And so he was just kind of describing like what things are, people are going through that would choose this option for them. Now, you said Minnesota, obviously, or maybe not obviously to other people, but I know because I was just reading about this. Minnesota is not one of the states on where you can have this option. What states so if somebody in Minnesota was at that point where they were looking for this kind of a resolution, where would they have to actually leave the state and go to a state? And then what would that process kind of look like?
Yes, currently, yes. Now, there actually is a bill in the Minnesota legislature that they plan to, it may get out of committee for the next session. But currently, if somebody in Minnesota wants to take advantage of medical aid in dying, they would have to go to one of the 9 states where it is legal. I actually have this list here. The closest state to us, Colorado, probably, as far as just physical location. Now, one of the challenges there, though, is that each state has its own requirements. And some states require that you be a resident of the state for a certain length of time. That was one of the problems when I first found out about this back in 2016. There's a fairly famous case, a gal named Brittany Maynard, I can never remember. She was fairly young. She was only 29 years old, and she had an inoperable brain tumor. And she made the pages of the press. She was actually on the cover of People magazine. She was very personable, very sociable, very camera friendly. And she made the decision to move from California to Oregon because it wasn't legal in California. And then she talked about how difficult that was because then she had to start all over with new doctors. She had to uproot, her family went with her. And so everything got uprooted. So depending on where you are. Now, more recently, actually, and this is not so much for Minnesotans, but the Minnesota bill is taking advantage of some of the lessons learned from the other states. And very recently in Vermont, which is one of the states where it is legal, if you don't know, you can live on a corner of Vermont and literally be across the street from Connecticut. And it's not unusual for somebody in Vermont to literally walk across the street and get all of their health care in Connecticut. So this woman lived in Connecticut. She got all her health care in Vermont. And she was denied the medical aid in dying because she wasn't a resident. She sued them and she won because they realized that medical aid in dying is considered a medical procedure, and it is the only medical procedure that has that residency requirement. So as long as you're allowed to get chemotherapy, you should be able to get medical aid in dying as far as they were concerned. So because of things like that, the other states are now amending their laws. And originally Oregon, for example, had 15-day waiting period between the verbal and written request. That is not in the New Mexico law because they just have a newer version because they realize that some patients might not even be diagnosed until they have a week left to go. And the 15 days was thought to be, cruel. So that's a long answer to about Minnesotans, but right now you would have to go to Colorado and you might have to move there before long before you really are eligible. So
Okay.
that's one of the challenges.
So there's, the argument for it, but the argument against it. So where are some situations that would make people ineligible, basically, for being able to, like, certain, things that they're going through.
Sure.
That way,
Sure.
I mean, because I would approach this from, I could see how this could also be abused, so how do you avoid the potential for it being used wrongly?
Right. Okay. So most of the states are patterned after the Oregon law. So I'll use that as a model. So the Oregon law, I mentioned there has to be a written and verbal request, and I think 2 written requests. And originally it was a 15-day waiting period. You have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness by an attending physician, terminal being within 6 months of a natural death. You have to be pass all the tests to be a sound mind. So you have to be considered mentally capable. And if there's any question about that by the attending physician, they are required by law to call in a psychiatrist or psychologist to give a more extensive test. So there are those built-in safeguards. Other safeguards really are in the favor of the doctors. No doctor or hospitals are required to participate. And when I do presentations, one of the concerns is they may have a doctor who is all for it, but the doctor may have admitting privileges to a certain hospital, and he knows that if he participates in a medical aid and dying situation, he will lose those admitting privileges. And so sometimes their hands are tied.
Mm-hmm.
As far as safeguards, probably the best way I can answer that is that as part of Oregon's law being, going through, it was required that the people behind it study. They take active polls. Why are you doing this? What are the results? And after 20 plus years now, there has never been a case of abuse. There was one where there was a questionable ethically, but that was resolved. No doctors have ever been charged with anything. No family members have ever been charged with coercing a family, their loved one. And that's the other part of the mental capability is that a physician, I believe in most states where it's legal, the physician has to talk to the family members, and the physician must be convinced that this person is acting on their own volition. So those are the basic safeguards. And the other thing, touching on the sound mind, that actually gets to be a bit of a catch-22, because let's say, you have stage 4 lung cancer, and you're likely to be gone in 6 months. So okay, you qualify, you're all fine. But what if you're diagnosed with, say, stage 2 lung cancer, and you've tried chemo and it worked, but now the cancer is back and it's growing and it's aggressive, and they say, well, okay, you're probably not within 6 months, but and happened with my father who died of lung cancer a long time ago. Many cancer patients, once they go through chemo, they say, I'll never do that again.
Right.
And so a lot of people will not go through that again. So they know it's going to aggressively spread now. Well, let's just say that you have cancer, it's going to grow, but because it's only stage 2, you're likely going to live for maybe a year to year and a half. Well, what if you also have a family medical history of dementia? By the time you get within that last 6 months, you may no longer be of sound mind. So
Right.
automatically, anybody who is in front of that 6-month window, if there's any chance of dementia, you don't qualify. The same thing happens with a lot of degenerative neuromuscular diseases. You got Parkinson's, MS, muscular dystrophy, Lou Gehrig's disease, all those. ALS is one of the few that will actually kill you by itself. But the other ones, by the time you get to the point where you're basically dead anyway, you're no longer capable of speaking. Sometimes you're not capable of thinking straight. And another big requirement of medical aid in dying is that you must be able to self-administer. And that usually means swallow. Well, if you're Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, you probably will have lost your capability of swallowing long before you're within 6 months. So the restrictions are there to prevent abuse, like you're saying, and that's working. Unfortunately, it also means that many, many people will never qualify. So that's the challenge. And it was actually, when I got involved with this, I first got involved with the group called Compassion and Choices. And they're a national organization. They're the big driving force behind lobbying and actually helping people write the laws. When I realized how restrictive it is and how many people are left out, and because I was a hospice chaplain, many of my hospice patients wouldn't have qualified for it because they have lost the ability to swallow. Especially if they've had throat or esophageal cancer, they couldn't swallow anymore. And so many of my hospice patients wouldn't have qualified for it for various reasons. So I thought, well, what do these people do? So then I found this organization called Final Exit Network. And what Final Exit Network does basically is it's also a national organization, but it operates in all 50 states plus Washington, D.C. And people will contact Final Exit Network when they get a diagnosis and they don't know what their options are, so they come to us. Often we will say, well, where do you live? Because if you do live in a state where it's legal, we will often suggest that you see if you qualify for that. But if you don't qualify for that, then we go to the next stage. And Final Exit Network will provide support to people who would not qualify for medical aid in dying because of the severe restrictions of medical aid in dying. So that's usually where people go, wait a minute, what are you talking about? So in layman's terms, depending on how you define it, it's essentially assisted suicide.
Okay.
However, we are very, very careful to work within the law because assistance is defined differently in every state. Usually it means providing something physical. So let's just say I know that you want to end your suffering and I know what you're going to do and I know when you're going to do it. And because I'm with Final Exit Network, I have offered to sit with you as you do it so that you can feel not alone. So you do that. And then when you're done, I leave, but maybe you didn't want anybody to know that you did that. And so you say, well, will you please take this? Because there's some equipment involved. And so in some states, I'm not allowed to remove the equipment. Other states, I can. So like I say, each state is different. And so we're very careful to work within it. Now, Minnesota, oddly enough, is the only state where they consider talking to be assistance. It's a goofy situation, but it's based on this case years ago where this male nurse got on the internet and supposedly talked some teenager overseas into committing suicide. They found him guilty, put him in jail, but the wording around it was speech that enables suicide because he was in Minnesota. She was in Europe. So how do you draw that line? So in Minnesota, the way they decided to draw that line was you and I can sit here and talk about it all day long. But if I have a reasonable suspicion that you're actually thinking about it, then me talking to you is considered assisting in a suicide. And
so who gets to determine where that line is drawn?
That is an excellent question. And I was involved in a court situation where the bottom line was it's prosecutorial discretion, whether or not they want to push that. Okay. So it's just weird. Like I say, Minnesota is the only state that has that little goofy law. So, in fact, technically, and I remember the judge actually asking the DA this or whoever it was, that if because it's the book that we base our guidance on is available in any bookstore. It's called Final Exit. It's in libraries. So if I
Mhm.
go into a library and I say, hey, I want this book called Final Exit, can you show me where it is? And they do, that's fine. But if I say, hey, I'm thinking about committing suicide, can you show me where this book is? At that point, the librarian becomes complicit in an assisted suicide if she shows me the book. It's really strange.
So
So,
it's up. I don't know. Like, when you leave that, it's going to depend on who's willing to prosecute and how far that they're willing to take it.
yes,
That's obviously there's a lot of gray areas in these kinds of situations.
right,
Ultimately, except for the final outcome of death, there's no gray area in that.
correct,
So,
right, right.
I did have a question regarding, I'm assuming for the most part, this is a conversation about adults that can make these choices.
Oh,
Are
yes,
there
yes.
any states in our country where that might apply to children also?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
No, it's a very clear delineation. You must be an adult of sound mind. And even with Final Exit Network, you do need to be diagnosed with an actual physical illness. You can't just come to us and say, you broke up with your girlfriend. Do you want to end it all? We don't participate in those kinds of things. You have to have a diagnosable, documented physical illness that would qualify you to be terminally ill, but it may not be within the next 6 months. Or it would qualify you as most likely you will lose all of your autonomy in your bodily functions. So we take all these things into consideration, and there's actually a medical evaluation committee, which consists of multiple licensed practitioners of various disciplines who all verify the medical records before we can decide whether or not to take somebody on as a client.
Okay. So, Joey, do you have any? I don't want to leave you out in case I know you're probably thinking of something.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about the fact that when I have heard about this topic, the majority of the time it has been in relation to Canada and the way its government and provincial governments handle assisted suicide or medical aid in dying. And I just want to point out to our audience the catastrophism you've heard about medical aid in dying with regards to Canadians and particularly teenage Canadians. This isn't Canada, and our healthcare system works in a drastically different fashion than theirs does.
That's true.
Joey, I'm actually very glad you brought that up because most of the people who I am involved with in Final Exit Network would like nothing more than for us to have the same healthcare system as Canada. And as a libertarian, my whole view on this is I don't think the government or any church should be able to dictate how and when you die. It should be completely up to you. Now, I've mentioned to other people, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, but if you want to do it, have at it. But then you're responsible for the consequences of that. So that's one of the reasons I'm totally opposed to universal health care. Well, in Canada, one of the problems now is that they have universal health care. Therefore, somebody's taxes may be paying for somebody else's assisted suicide when they're really, it just totally disagrees with them. That anyway, so I'm glad you brought up the Canadian situation because I argue with my colleagues in Final Exit Network says no, 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 no. The worst thing for us would be if we adopted universal health care because then I could not support it because as a libertarian, I don't want taxes to be used for something I don't agree with.
Yeah, because it removes consent from the equation. Because
Yes,
here in this country, the way in which that sort of thing is paid for is either not involving taxes or involving it in a much more obscure way. But if we switch to the Canadian healthcare model, taxes would be directly involved in nearly every medical practice, if not every medical practice.
exactly. So I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't want universal health care because then it also means universal death care. And that's not the road I want to go down.
Well, would that also, like, if the government were to regulate that nationwide, maybe, I mean, because a lot of what I've seen too is a lot of criticism from Canada in that it's, I think, don't quote me on this, I'm just remembering reading something about, like offering that to kids, and there, like you said, teenagers, but then there was a younger or a wider age gap or something like that, um, governed by a people who may not have the best interest of the people in mind, or may just be eugenists, or where. So
Yeah.
like, how do you? Because talking about this, ultimately that comes up in conversation.
Yes.
The
Yes.
association.
And it's not so much in Canada right now as it is in Europe, where assisted suicide has been going on for a while, particularly in Switzerland. And there have been, I don't know how many, but there have been minors who have gone under that. And if you read the details, every one of them is typically a long-term cancer patient, and the child has actually said, "I don't want to go through that again." And I actually have a personal connection with that because part of my training as a chaplain was I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at the time, and I was working as part of my training at Sanford Hospital, and I was working in the pediatrics unit.
Okay.
And one of my very first patients was a 16-year-old young man who was there because he had had stomach cancer the prior year, and it went into remission, and now it was back. And I was brought in on an ethics consult because he didn't want further treatment. But because he was only 16, he could be overridden by his grandmother, who was legal guardian. And so it got to be a long involved thing. So anyway, yes, the children, and oddly enough, in that particular case, he actually was a Native American, and he had already gone through the traditional rite of passage to have adult decisions made. So if his grandmother had not brought him into the hospital, but instead had sought treatment on the reservation, his decision would have been honored. The fact that he brought them into the white man's hospital, suddenly that decision was taken away from him. Ultimately, the grandmother relented, and he did die within a few months because he refused to take treatment. And anyway, I don't know for a fact that all of the minors who have undergone medical aid and dying in Europe, but I do know I've read several cases because I do get exposed to that. And so far, I have not seen any evidence that any of them are coerced into it. And we could have conversations. One of the big opposing forces of medical aid and dying, both Compassion Choices and Final Exit Network, which has fewer restrictions. The two loudest voices against are the conservative churches, so Catholics and evangelicals, but also the Right to Life movement. Specifically, there's a group called Not Dead Yet. And it's a coalition of people who may have teenagers who are disabled. And they are afraid, very afraid, that this law will somehow lead into some doctor deciding that their child doesn't deserve to die. And that's why the medical aid and dying laws and Final Exit Network's own policies, it always requires consent from the individual. And there needs to be documented evidence that that person is not being coerced. Now,
Okay.
we could always talk hypotheticals about, what if a 12-year-old is in a coma? Well, I don't know. I just know that as a libertarian and as a hospice chaplain, I don't want the government making that decision.
Yeah, I've
So,
seen those groups you mentioned, and having opposition to it, but based on that they, like I said, I brought up eugenics, is where they don't want it used as a tool to try and control kids who others might deem unworthy or incapable or something. And I think
Right.
kind of in some ways that might go back still to like just, World War II. And, because those stories still circulate, the way that Hitler approached handicap and that kind of stuff. And I don't know, maybe it originates some there, but
well, you actually bring up an interesting point, because one of the opposition points is often referred to as the slippery slope.
Yeah.
And something I actually learned when I was in graduate school, seminary, and this is from an ethics professor, is that this term slippery slope actually has no basis in fact.
Right.
Because if you look at it deeply enough, it's all about looking at the intentions. Well, if anybody goes back and looks at Hitler, you find out very quickly that he always wanted to take over all of Europe. He wanted to take over the world. It wasn't a matter of, okay, we'll give him Poland and he'll be happy. No, that was never his intention. The challenge is finding out what their true intentions are. And now the other side of this, since we're a little bit of, the politics, libertarians versus the others, is that if you look through history, most of the time when there was a slippery slope argument that had any merit, it was always somebody with the more liberal view that wanted more. Anytime there was an argument brought up by a conservative and somebody said, well, you're going down a slippery slope, there is no evidence that anything proposed by a political conservative that they wanted anything more than what they asked for right there. And it's actually in their name, conservative. They don't want to push the envelope in that way. It's usually on the liberal side of things where they want to keep pushing. So bottom line is the slippery slope applies to liberals, but it doesn't really apply to conservatives in history anyway. If you recognize that fascism is just a form of socialism and liberal communism and the state authoritarianism.
Right. So I was a former medic. Honestly, when I talked to you about this the first time, there's, a part of being, a medic and being anything that's medical, do no harm. And which in some ways that goes against, you're supposed to try and heal and protect and treat and take care of people. But ultimately, my time as a medic also taught me that sometimes you can do everything right and it doesn't matter. Like, you can go by the book in treatment and all those kinds of things. And death is just simply out of our hands.
Right. Right.
So this is kind of, for me, and still there's a part of me that's like resistant to it, but
sure.
If you're in that situation though, and that your life is at its end, it changes the perspective also. So.
Right. And I guess I would challenge you a little bit in your background as a medic. Let's just say that you knew that if your colleague could just hold on for a couple hours longer or whatever, that maybe there would be treatment available. Or in some cases, and I'm sure you're aware of situations like this, where somebody, yes, they may live, but their quality of life is going to be nothing. Now, if you have a choice as a medic to either treat them or not treat them, and they ask you not to, what do you do?
Yeah. In the medical, you also have the orders, the do not resuscitate orders. And so there are certain things that you are obligated to follow that are made in advance for some of those situations. But
Right. So now you talked about like the Hippocratic Oath and whatnot. And as a chaplain, with that religious training, one of the things that I often challenge the medical professionals is, well, when you say do no harm, why are you only limiting it to the physical? Mm-hmm. What about their spiritual needs? What if they are ready? What if they want to go? Why is the medical profession so insistent on prolonging physical life? And in fact, one of the things I'm toying with here is I wrote a series of articles, and I realized I probably had the beginnings of a book. I often challenge my own colleagues as chaplains, if they have any kind of a Christian background. I say, if you believe that there's something better after this life, why are you not celebrating a death? Didn't you just win the lottery? You know, why are Christians afraid of death? And why don't they welcome it? Anyway, it's just an ongoing conversation. I personally think that one of the reasons why Christians fear death is because they bought into the story about they're afraid they're not going to be saved, and there's always that fear, and so they think that they have to always, just hang on, just make sure. So anyway, that's one of my theories, is that one of the reasons that Christians fear death is because they're not entirely sure that they're going to be, going to whatever they think heaven is.
So when you, as a hospice chaplain, how often, when people who were, dealing with their impending death, how often did they fear it versus accept it? Where were people generally on that line?
I never met a hospice patient who wasn't ready.
Okay.
Contrarily, most of my patients were their families. They weren't ready to let go. Mm-hmm. Usually by the time a person is in hospice, they've already been through treatments maybe. It's not new to them. But by the time they actually are in hospice and I'm visiting them as a hospice patient, they're ready. There's no question. Now, every once in a while, because I was part of the team that would go on and bring people onto hospice. And so they may still be in shock because they've just been diagnosed with late stage cancer and they didn't know about it before for whatever reason. And so they're dealing with that shock. And so they may not be ready, but they quickly become ready. They just, like I say, I never met a hospice patient who wasn't ready. So it actually surprised me. I fully expected them to, and they weren't. And they're always ready to go. In fact, they often ask, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, you keep going.
I was just going to say, on multiple occasions, I would have my conversations with the patients were them asking me, how do I convince my loved ones to let me go? And that was especially difficult when the loved one was the parent of a child, or sometimes an adult child. In fact, probably 2 years ago, maybe, I'm called in on Final Exit Network cases, even if I'm not personally involved with them, because I'm kind of the spiritual advisor for the whole organization. And I had a conversation with a client. I think, if I recall correctly, he was a younger man in maybe his 40s. And he ended up what we call self-delivering, just because people don't like the other word. So he did die on his own. And I talked with him before that. 6 months later, I was talking with his mother. And the mother called me to thank me. And that's one of the greatest gifts I've ever had, was the mother of an adult child who thanked me for, just my counsel. And one of the things I'm always very careful to say is, I'm not going to try to convince you to do this. I'm just here to support you and help you explore your own challenges and your own acceptance and where you are with it.
Do you think that there's some freedom in that, being a chaplain versus like a doctor who, just the mindset is different?
Yes. Well, yes, absolutely yes. But what I'm thinking of is there's always an exception, and the exceptions are typically the old family doctor who knows the family very well, and they have a long-standing relationship. And so they will regard them as a friend as well as a patient. In fact, one thing that happens very often in hospice care is that the patient will ask the doctor to give them more pain medication. Well, the doctor knows very well that they're not feeling any pain. And so it's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Oh, I see. You're asking me to give you enough to put you out of your misery. And because I know you and my kids grew up with your kids, I will honor that. And so they actually give them a lethal dose of medicine. And in the hospice industry, they came up with a special term for it, and it's called double effect. Yes, Judge, I gave him enough medication to stop his heart, but my primary motivation was to mitigate his pain. And therefore, they say, as long as your primary motivation wasn't to kill them, you're good. And that happens every day in hospice and even in hospitals. You know, they give them enough medication that will most likely result in respiratory failure, but they're giving it because the patient says, I'm in pain.
In that kind of a circumstance where, like, the doctor is residing in a state that, you know, doesn't have death with dignity laws, is there legal protection for them if they find themselves in that situation?
In the states that do have death with dignity laws, there is legal protection. And now states that don't have it, that's why I say it's if they're in hospice care, then they do that double effect thing. Now, on the states where it is legal, the protections there are that's why the patient has to take themselves. The doctor can't, give it to you because that's physical assistance. The doctor, like I think I mentioned earlier, a doctor is not required to participate. But the other thing is that if they do go through with it and the patient dies, the cause of death that's on the death certificate is not the medication. They are legally allowed to list as the cause of death whatever the underlying disease is that would have killed them anyway. Okay. So I think that's a universal thing, is that they're never going to be charged with something like that in those states where it's legal.
It's kind of a this is a heavy topic.
Yes, it is. And I always come back to the libertarian perspective of it's your life and it's your death. And what right do I have to tell you anything about your living or your death? Now, I'm never going to try to talk you into it. Most likely will try to talk you out of it, but I'll help you explore, where are you with this? Why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. I think back, I happened to be working at Mercy Hospital in Coon Rapids when Robin Williams killed himself. And I remember some talking head on Fox was just berating Robin Williams, calling him a coward. And we've all heard that, suicide is often called the coward's way out and that kind of thing. And so somebody, I think it was on a Facebook page or something, was commenting about the fact that this Fox News host was calling Robin Williams a coward. And at that time, we actually didn't know that he had been diagnosed with, I can't remember what it's called, but some kind of dementia, I guess. But we knew that Robin Williams had been suffering from depression for quite a while already. Mm-hmm. And this particular person challenged everybody and he said, if you can imagine the will to live and how incredibly strong that is, everybody wants to live. I mean, I'm sure, Rebecca, in military situations, you've probably seen things, it's amazing what people will overcome in order to live. It's the most powerful, probably the most powerful force in the universe. Okay, well, now imagine something stronger, like depression. And now imagine living with it for 10 years before Robin Williams killed himself. So this particular person said, instead of calling Robin Williams a coward, I choose to mark him as very courageous for dealing with it for 10 years. And it kind of turned my head around. It's like, that's a very different perspective. Acknowledge the struggle that these people have. And so even when it comes to mental health, who am I to judge whether the pain inside someone's brain is any less than the pain of cancer in their lungs or anything? So,
Right.
we're nowhere near in a society ready to condone suicide strictly because you have depression. But it just gives me a different avenue to recognize that, for people who say, I can't deal with it anymore. They haven't slept in months. They can't stop the voices in their head. I just refuse to judge those people because I don't live in their head.
Right. Robin Williams had Lewy body dementia.
That's what it
That was
was.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he
Yeah.
had been diagnosed with. So, and I'm part of the veteran community. We have a very high suicide rate. I mean, it kind of depends on which, which source you're reading, as whether it's 22 a day or 40. I've heard reports up to 40, 45 suicides a day. And I mean, and having been personally affected by that through fellow veterans that we knew that were not able to overcome the things that we went through, and having actually, fought that battle myself to some degree, it really, I think one of the things that people need to recognize about suicide in relation to depression is that it only takes once to not be able to overcome what you're feeling for you to lose the battle to suicide. It doesn't matter, and so we have this like perception in society where, like you said, it's a coward's way out. But what about the last 15 years of fighting those battles every day and overcoming it, when
Right.
it only takes once of not being able to for you to lose the battle completely, and there's no recovering from that. You can't come back from it because there's nothing you can do after death. It's final.
Right. And that's always one of the arguments. But what you're touching on tangentially is rational versus irrational suicide. And for many years, there was an open conversation about rational suicide. Back to Socrates' day, he took hemlock. It was a well thought out plan, especially in military circles. We've all seen movies, and you've probably experienced it personally, where somebody gets mortally wounded. They're leaving an area, they're surrounded by the enemy, and their best buddy makes sure that they have one round in their pistol left over. And the understanding is that he's not going to allow himself to be captured. In other words, he's going to commit suicide in order to avoid something worse. Well, we consider that a noble thing to do. I'm just saying we should apply that same level of nobility to anybody, as long as they think it through and it is a very rational process. Then I just think it shouldn't be our decision, and it shouldn't be the government's decision. It shouldn't be a church's decision. Now, one thing that I want to bring up is that when I started with Final Exit Network and I joined their speakers bureau, at that time, the assumption was that we had to convince people. But we very quickly learned that anytime you start talking about this and people start thinking it through, and they think back to, I wish this would have been an option when my grandma died, or when my brother died, or when my mother died, invariably, people would simply say, I wish I had known about you before. So the Speakers Bureau has completely shifted. We're no longer in the persuasion business. Right now, we're just trying to get the word out that we exist. And so when people ask me, well, what can we do to help? I just say, tell your friends and neighbors, go to finalexitnetwork.org and request a speaker. We'll be happy to come out and talk to anybody about what we do. And we always say we are never going to encourage this. But what we want to do is make sure that you feel supported. And touching onto the mental health aspects, often what happens, because we're not giving people any information that they don't already have access to, but they have often temporarily lost the capacity just to think, because they've just been given a diagnosis, and they can't think straight yet. I mean, you can go on the internet and find all kinds of ways to end your life, But nobody thinks about it. Well, now suddenly you're faced with, how do I do this, and how can I do it peacefully, painlessly, without leaving a mess, having the support of my family, and all these things. And that's what Final Exit Network does, is help you to explore your options and basically just kind of bring you back to reality and say, okay, we recognize you're on total emotion. That part of your brain is preventing you from having rational thought. So we're here to get you back on track and let you think about it. So think about it and let us know if you want to proceed. And then, then we go to the next stage if they really want to do that. But it really has to be very convincingly, and there is no gray area in this. It has to be a very rational, thought out process. They have to have a bona fide, documented physical illness that either will end their life or will severely debilitate them. And so those are the only people that we allow ourselves to work with.
So, in the Libertarian Party, or Libertarian in general, you have the NAP, non-aggression principle. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this would could coexist with that, because the motive is not to hurt them. The motive is to help them.
Yes,
and
right.
There's no coercion. Nobody's profiting off of what somebody chooses to do at the end of their life. So that where maybe, like I said, somebody with a medical background may have a hard time coming to terms with that.
Right, because they're focused on the physical.
Yep. So my family actually just got home. So I'm going to wrap this up before it gets really crazy in the background. But I want to tell you, thank you for, coming on and talking to us about this. And I really appreciate it. This is, like I said, it's a very heavy topic and it's a lot to think about, especially if nobody's ever thought about it before. So
right.
I just wanted to...
I appreciate the opportunity. And again, if anybody out there wants more information, just go to finalexitnetwork.org, request a speaker. You can use my name if you want to talk to me personally, but there's other speakers too. We'll be happy to talk about it. To me, it always comes down to, it's your life, it's your death, it should be your choice.
And if you are interested in joining the party and you've been watching the podcast, it's lpmn.org, and you can find the link and join the party. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.